welcome to the On Civilization lecture series. The idea for this came from a few sources, but one was from watching Kenneth Clark's series Civilization, filmed in 1969. Now, on the one hand, there's something very nostalgic about seeing when things like that used to be on television, thinking, wow, they really used to talk about some interesting things back then. But equally, some of the things he said are a bit outdated, talking about primitive people and so on. It made me think we don't really talk that much about civilization anymore. Rather than even confront what we mean by that or what we need to restore or repair, we just sort of ignore the whole idea. So the thinking behind this lecture series is, why don't we start that process of rethinking, of reconstructing? Now, by no means do I personally know enough about societies and civilizations all over the world and all over time, but let's give it a go, see how far we get, and see what comes out of that conversation and discussion. So the plan for today is for us to talk for about an hour, maybe less, maybe more, and then do that once a month. The first lecture today will be setting up a framework, and the subsequent lectures will be held on the second Thursday of every month. So I should introduce myself first. My name is Eric Lybeck. I'm sure a lot of you might know me. One of the things I've done recently is set up the engine room, which we're in today. I'm technically a senior lecturer in education at the University of Manchester. I also work in the Manchester Urban Institute. My background's in sociology. And a lot of the questions my research engaged with in the past was the history of universities. And I came across a lot of these examples of university extension movements and engagements between university academics and the public. And that's another thing that seems to have gone by the wayside. Perhaps it's even related to this decline in civilization, or the reason why we don't talk about such big questions anymore. So rather than jump straight into why we should think of civilization today in a certain way, I thought I'd put that at the end of the lecture series. What I thought I'd do today is to introduce one particular definition of civilization that I quite like. This is from jazz critic Stanley Crouch, and it was featured in the documentary Jazz by Ken Burns.
And it's an epic vision that is both ethnic and all-inclusive. That's the thing about him that's so remarkable, is that it's Negroid without being exclusive. In Duke Ellington's music, there's always, hey, come on in. So there's a kind of a welcoming quality that you associate with the highest form of civilization, I would suggest. See, because civilization in a certain sense can be reduced to the word welcome.
And so with that, I'd like to welcome everyone again to the lectures. And I do mean welcome in exactly that sense, which is completely characteristic of Ellington. And I think this sets up a kind of baseline definition, but doesn't do much for the structure of how we might analyze the question of civilization. So let's get into the documentaries that we've been looking at. First, Kenneth Clark's Civilization explored the history of Western art, culture, and philosophy more or less from the fall of Rome, which is a classic starting point for this type of conversation. And he takes it up to about the 20th century. In general, he was trying to understand why civilization seems to be fragmenting in the 1960s. He thought, if I give my personal story of what I think civilization is and what we stand to lose, maybe that could help us. Throughout this, he frames it as his own personal view. It's his own position. But he structures civilization as a fragile thing that has fallen before. And that's a sort of classic observation. Civilizations are things that can fall. It's not a stable thing. It needs to be preserved and held on to. And that's what he's trying to do with his documentary. So here's a clip from the end of the series, which I think captures some of his position and some of what I think we're getting at.
Well, naturally, these bright-minded young people think poorly of existing institutions and want to abolish them. One doesn't need to be young to dislike institutions. But the dreary fact remains that even in the darkest ages, it was institutions which made society work. And if civilization is to survive, society must somehow be made to work. At this point, I reveal myself in my true colors as a stick in the mud. I hold a number of beliefs that have been repudiated by the liveliest intellects of our time. I believe that order is better than chaos, creation better than destruction. I prefer gentleness to violence, forgiveness to vendetta. On the whole, I think that knowledge is preferable to ignorance, and I am sure that human sympathy is more valuable than ideology. I believe that in spite of recent triumphs of science, men haven't changed much in the last 2,000 years. And in consequence, we must still try to learn from history. History is ourselves. I also hold one or two beliefs that are more difficult to put shortly. For example, I believe in courtesy, the ritual by which we avoid hurting other people's feelings by satisfying our own egos. And I think we should remember that we are part of a great whole, which, for convenience, we call nature. All living things are our brothers and sisters. Above all, I believe in the God-given genius of certain individuals, and I value a society that makes their existence possible.
So, one of the main observations from Clarke's analysis of civilization is not just how we explain what civilization is, but also how societies recognize art, genius, and cultural production. So Vikings may have made art, primitive societies may have made art, but that wasn't necessarily civilization. Now, John Ruskin, in his address to the Cambridge School of Art, identified the most important thing for craftspeople to learn, and that is how to recognize the best possible version of art. Through understanding just a few masters, that's how an artist understands his potential and his limitations. Now, Kenneth Clarke argues that civilization is a society that recognizes greatness when it sees it. After a few years, after Civilization, 1972, John Berger, a cultural critic from the following generation, produced a documentary almost directly in response to Clarke's, called Ways of Seeing, and this drew on the latest critical cultural theory that was becoming prevalent in the academy at that time. So
not for one moment would I deny or belittle the significance and achievement of paintings like these. But we should not confuse these exceptional paintings, and everything in the museums, everything said by art experts, encourages this confusion. We should not confuse such exceptional works with the purpose and significance of the general tradition. Let me show the difference again, this time at the highest level. 2 self-portraits by Rembrandt. One when he was young, one when he was old. But the difference between them isn't just a question of how age changes a man's character. In the first painting, Rembrandt used the style and methods of the tradition for their traditional purposes, as an advertisement for the owner's good fortune, prestige, and wealth. In the later painting, he has turned the tradition against itself. All has gone, except a sense of the question of existence as a question. Intermittently, the tradition can breed within itself a counter-tradition. But the basic values of the tradition win in the end. This painting now has a fabulous price on its head, perhaps £3 million. It has itself become a fabulous object of property. Of course, a lot more can be said about European oil painting than I have said. Yet what I have tried to show is a fundamental part of the truth which is usually ignored. We study other cultures far away as anthropology. That's to say, we study them from the outside, judge them purely according to their own explanations of themselves. Now, if we look at the culture of the European oil painting in the same spirit, leaving aside its own claims for itself, I believe we will find that oil painting was, before everything else, a medium which celebrated private possessions. The tradition of the oil painting has now been broken once and for all. In some ways, publicity has taken its place. The sight of it makes us want to possess it. And publicity is the subject of our program next week.
So Berger's argument pushes against Clark's thesis. He's arguing that great works of art often resist tradition rather than conform to it. Rembrandt, when he conforms to tradition, is developing a style, but not producing something groundbreaking. Berger suggests that the cultural critic should recognize not what is great within the tradition, but what resists it. At the same time, he's arguing that tradition will still win in the end. Even radical artists will eventually be co-opted into the canon. Here Berger's engaging with Walter Benjamin's ideas about mechanical reproduction and the loss of aura in art. Benjamin argues that mass reproduction of art removes something unique, the aura, which is tied to time and place. Berger applies this idea to advertising and consumer culture, exploring how traditional art's values translate into contemporary publicity. By tracking Clark to Berger, we see a contrast. One is positive about Western civilization, the other is critical. But both engage intellectually. Berger, though critical, still depends on Clark's framing of civilization. Now, Civilizations, made in 2018, was developed directly by the BBC. Unlike Kenneth Clark, it was not a personal view. It was probably written by a committee of people at the BBC, and its aim was to undermine the Eurocentric view of Clark and replace it with the diversity of culture. This always reminds me a bit of how the 2012 London Olympic ceremony, there was this real optimism in the idea that you could put people from different parts of the world into the 19th century Industrial Revolution and they could then feel included in this national history. But it was unreal because people from other parts of the world were not engaged as factory owners, but they were engaged with Britain through empire. As someone who studies the Victorian era, that period often gets reduced to cliches, children as chimney sweeps and men with top hats, women in uncomfortable clothing. But that doesn't enlighten us about how the civilization actually worked. So what I'll do is I'll show a clip now of the Civilizations program. It's a bit longer than the others, but what I want to do is highlight that it replaces the entire idea, the entire question of where art comes from. Is it from tradition? Is it from counter-tradition? And it replaces it with this idea that everybody can make art. And they sort of point at things and say, look at all this art, anybody can do it. And as much as it tries to be inclusive, I find it very patronizing, like patting someone on the head and saying, "It's okay, you can make art too." Isn't that good? It also doesn't make any attempt to define civilization. It just says we know it when we see it. Anyway, I'll play the clip now.
We can spend a lot of time debating what civilization is or isn't, but when its opposite shows up, in all its brutality and cruelty and intolerance and lust for destruction, we know what civilization is. We know it from the shock of its imminent loss as a mutilation on the body of our humanity. The record of human history brims over with the rage to destroy. But it's also imprinted with the opposite instinct, to make things that go beyond the demands of food and shelter, things that make us see the world and our place in it in a different light. We are the art-making animal, and this is what we have made.
After all, there is another perspective, the art of the Native Americans themselves. Because even the nomadic Plains Indians recorded key events on their portable belongings. It was a traditional art form that began to show the influence of European contact. This image, painted onto an animal hide, was produced by people of the Cheyenne Nation. It's a depiction of the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, one of the few major Native American victories in the so-called Indian Wars. And through artifacts like this, the Native Americans recorded their plight in their own artistic traditions, and there are, inevitably, many more images of defeat than victory. This is the work of people who were the victims, not the beneficiaries of manifest destiny. This is art from the other side of the frontier, art that records how the West was lost. While George Catlin was trying to preserve the culture of Native Americans on canvas, on the far side of the world, another artist would take a very different view of the indigenous people he met on the frontiers of empire. In 1874, Gottfried Lindauer, a Czech artist from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, arrived in New Zealand, known to its original inhabitants as Aotearoa. Lindauer arrived after decades of warfare, in which the Maori had lost much of their land to the British. The Czech painter suddenly found his skills much in demand, producing portraits of Maori men and women. To begin with, the portraits were commissioned by European settlers, eager to preserve a record of Maori culture for posterity. They believed that the Maori, like the Native Americans, were a dying race. But the Maori didn't regard themselves as a doomed people, and by the 1890s, their population was on the increase after decades of decline. And they were absolutely determined to forge a new future in which their culture, their traditions, their language, and the memories of their ancestors were all to be kept alive and kept vibrant. And one of the ways they did this was by co-opting the talents of Gottfried Lindauer and commissioning him to paint their portraits, but on terms dictated by them, to their tastes, and according to how they wanted to be seen and to be remembered. For Lindauer, it didn't matter whether his commissions came from Europeans or from the Maori elite. He treated both as he would any paying customer. Artistically, the style was always resolutely European. But for his Maori patrons and their families, Lindauer's paintings began to assume an entirely new level of meaning. As a people who had always venerated their ancestors, many Maori came to regard the portraits of Lindau not just as memorials to their ancestors, but as almost living icons that kept their spirit alive in the present. Now, today, Lindau's portraits are scattered all over the world in museums and galleries, but some, including this one, have remained within a single family, passed down through the generations. This is Te Rangiotu, a Maori chieftain, but also a successful businessman who had the wealth and the foresight to commission this portrait from Lindau in 1884. Now, what's really significant is that when Lindau was painting portraits of Maori for European customers, he tended to paint them in traditional costume. But many Maori patrons who had their portraits painted by Lindau demanded that they be shown in a hybrid mixture of European and traditional dress to show that they were people who could freely move between the two cultures.
So I find that putting these three programs next to each other, all in conversation with the original Kenneth Clark's Civilization, shows evidence of what Ruskin would say, that we're losing the capacity to separate works of art from just any painting. Now, this particular painting is not a particularly great painting, and David Olusoga is not a cultural critic. He's just saying, look, he's wearing a suit. He was a merchant as well. To him, this painting's identical to any other types of oil painting. There's no comparison he's making between this and a Rembrandt self-portrait. There's no sense in which the job of a program like this is to identify the best forms of art and the highest types of artistic production. It's not even saying what Berger was saying, which is that there needs to be some kind of resistance. So in Civilizations, the Native Americans fought at Little Bighorn and won, and he says that's one of only a handful of instances of indigenous people winning. They're ultimately described as victims. They're described as people who they tried hard, they painted, but look, they've also made these nice pictures on leather, on a piece of cloth. So the first thing we can say, just as an aside, is that indigenous people won many, many times, and there are examples of resistance across all the history of civilizations, but also the art is not engaging with the concerns that Clark or Berger have, which is, what are the conditions of a society that produce great works of culture, and what are the conditions in which those things start to fragment or fall apart, which is Clark's concern in the 1960s, or when do they become one-dimensional, when we lose the capacity to separate publicity, advertisement, and the consumption of art itself. In fact, the 2018 version of Civilization is ultimately a type of consumption in which the BBC is trying to sell us some version of inclusion that does not, in fact, even include the civilizations it's claiming to. The purpose of this lecture series, on Civilization, is to start this process again. Yes, Kenneth Clark was Eurocentric. Yes, he focused too much on great works of art and great men. Maybe we should look at women, lower classes, post-colonial contexts. But that doesn't mean we need to get rid of the idea that there's a relationship between how societies are organized and how culture is produced. If this program is anything to go by, the Civilizations program, we seem to have gone far astray and seem to have lost a bit of that sense. So this might be the main element of the sort of question, I suppose, for this lecture. But the rest of the course will now take us 12 months. So what we'll start to understand is if we look at civilization in a new way, reframing it, drawing on some of the things I've studied in the past, especially macro sociology, world history, and so on. There are many new, updated ways of understanding world history and it's the relationship between culture and societies. And if we can reconstruct our way of understanding that, we can also start to think about how this relates to cultural production and culture in general. So now what we're going to do is reframe what we mean by civilization. When I say reframe, I'm drawing particularly on the work of Norbert Elias. I've written a few books on him, and he'll keep coming up again and again across these lectures. Now, he defines knowledge as a means of orientation. It's a bit like a map. If we have knowledge of something, if we have a theory of how something works, that gives us a sense of the lay of the land. He describes the value of this knowledge using Edgar Allan Poe's short story, A Descent into the Maelstrom. It's about a big whirlpool that developed somewhere off the coast of Maine or Massachusetts. It creates a vortex going down into the sea. A fishing boat gets stuck in the whirlpool, going around in circles. They manage not to go in, but they're not actually getting out either. They just keep going around and around in circles. Elias describes this as if you're embedded in a situation and you're only looking in front of you, with no awareness of where things are. You just act in response to what's directly ahead of you. You keep going around in circles. To get out, you need to take a detached view. You need to see the whirlpool from the outside. You do that through abstraction. And once you recognize that, you can recognize that the best way out isn't straight ahead, but at a right angle. So knowledge, a means of orientation, is necessary to orient yourself to take a different action to the one that seems most obvious. So this new means of orientation is ultimately what we're after as we move on in this course. So what a lot of contemporary social science and cultural theory today are very similar to Clark and Burgess, who effectively seek civilization as a line. In Clark's case, he sees that line is getting better and better. Maybe it gets worse and goes into a decline, but it's a thing, and you can lose that thing or you can have that thing. A relational approach is not as interested in what civilization is, but what is civilization in relation to other things. So if you want to understand Western civilization, you would need to understand the idea of the West in relation to the East. And in fact, a huge portion of what we consider to be Western civilization is actually an artifact of the Cold War, in which you have Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And so this huge distinction is based off of a more contemporary issue that gets projected across time and space. People today now talk about the global North and the global South, and that's because we're more interested in developing nations compared to advanced industrial nations in the global North, and each of those are developing in relation to each other. But they're not necessarily things on their own terms, so that's what I'm trying to communicate. And a place we can begin is actually a fairly old-fashioned idea developed by a German sociologist called Alfred Weber, who made a distinction between what he called civilization and culture. So all three of those programs we watched are combining and conflating civilization and culture. They're saying civilization are these high forms of art, and what I'm suggesting is civilization can be understood the way Weber did, as the technical, organizational, and rational structures of a society. And culture can be identified as the more subjective, expressive, and spiritual elements of art that society produces. And those two things are always working in relation to one another, but they're not exactly the same thing. So we can specify that what the course over the long term is going to be about will be based off of the varieties and lineages of civilization and how those influence and are influenced by culture. So civilizations are a social organizational form. They're generally quite large, they're quite complex, and that complexity gives them advantages in terms of adapting to new situations. There's various ways, if you're interested in cybernetics and systems theories, there's ways that they can tell you that increased complexity can make a system more resilient and adaptable. So civilizations grow because they have the capacity to adapt to new situations and new environments. But the important thing, and this is why culture and art and spirituality are all related, is because civilizations are never just these technical systems. In fact, a huge portion of our technical systems fail all of the time. You just need to look at governments and state bureaucracies, even corporations, to tell that these things don't always work, and that they often enough produce feelings of anger, action, or inaction, and that's because they're systems that are made up of human beings. So once you establish that's what we're doing, you could see that civilization around the world at different points in times vary wildly from one way to another. So there are different things that seem to impact those adaptations and organizational forms. One is time-space compression, which geographer David Harvey has discussed. Another factor that seems to be an influence in most of the instances we've come across are that when two societies start to trade with one another, certain types of hybridization starts to happen. So the history of civilization of Western Europe is happening over here, the Eastern world is happening over there. But throughout most of human history, there's actually been all of these cultural exchanges. And those have generally been based off of linkages between trade networks. So that's another reason why I don't find the 2018 Civilizations show very compelling, because even there, they're sort of assuming that the Maori started to develop their culture and civilization at the point at which Europeans started to interact with them, whereas there's actually about 30,000 years of history that was a very substantial and complex and diverse history on its own terms well before the Europeans arrived. Lastly, there's also ecologies, and there's quite a lot of new scholarship that looks at the relationship between civilizations and the natural world. So those are going to be some of the most important things that we're looking at across this course. Now, some of the existing relational theories that I'm going to be drawing on, one of them is called world systems theory. It's been developed by a fellow named Emanuel Wallerstein, and it looks at the global development of the capitalist economy around the world, where certain nations are core nations that produce manufactured goods. Britain is a classic example, but there are prior nations that were the hegemon in the core. So previous to Britain, there was the Dutch Republic. Previous to the Dutch, there were Italian city-states in Venice and Genoa. And then after Britain, you've got the United States is sort of the hegemon of the global world system today. There's various ways in which the core states have international competition, United States versus the Soviet Union, Britain versus France, and then they extract resources from the periphery. And there are also these semi-peripheral countries that are sort of half in and half out. The significance of this and why it's a relational theory is that it shows the development of the periphery is always related to its function in the overall global system. So the classic example is the way Latin American states and their colonies developed based on the ways in which their resources were extracted from South America and sent to Europe. So things like sugar were a major impact on diets and economic complexity. So there's the slave trade is also influencing these Caribbean and Latin American states, creating plantations, changing the ecology of the South and Central American states. And so when in the 20th century, these countries are being expected to modernize in essentially the same pathway that the United States and other countries have gone through, they say, well, just do what the United States does. The Latin American scholars have said, we've actually developed in a different way. We're at a different starting point because there were 200, 300, 400 years of Spanish colonialism that changed the way we were organized. Similarly, you could look at places like Poland, where early on, about 500 years ago, they developed certain industries like wheat and wood to develop what you could call monocultures. So they produced one or two primary goods, and each place in the world system produced different things. Poland would produce this thing, Ukraine would produce that thing, Finland would produce that thing. And those are not the same as Britain, which produced a lot of different types of things out of those raw materials. And so that's because Poland's economy developed in relation to the core. So this is to highlight what relational thinking looks like. But the problem is world systems theory tends to focus too much on the economy and capitalism. So I much prefer this fellow's name is Michael Mann, and he's a sociologist at the University of California, Los Angeles, originally from Britain at the London School of Economics. And he says that any society generally has four major sources of social power: ideology, economics, military, and political power. Each one of these logics of power have their own logic and way of working. So ideologies might spread way across all different kinds of borders. You have multinational, international ideologies, whereas a military might just enforce the borders inside a territory. And normally the politics might say this is Germany and that's France, and we have two different polities, and then eventually you get the EU. But these are all organized according to different logics. It's not all about capitalism, which is closer to what the world systems theory was. So what we'll be using as a starting point in a lot of this course is this IEMP framework. I'm not going to go into huge detail about it now, but I wanted to show that this is a relational position, and it lends itself to considering civilizations without focusing on a straight line of development. So one of the important things to understand about this relational approach is that absence of linear thinking, because what a lot of evolutionary theorists historically have thought about was civilization is this sort of peak point, and everything that's before it in the line is somehow more primitive. And in general, a lot of those assumptions tended to be based off of technology. There's this book, Machines as the Measure of Men, by Michael Doss, that shows that civilization's machines were sort of or tools were a basis to say how far on the line of civilization they'd made. So they'd say that population over there is using hammers and axes. These ones are painting on a leather with pencils, whereas we've got computers and we have all these advanced technical equipments. And there's almost an instinct in all of these narratives to want to find some origin point, and then everything else moves as a line. So in science, one of those is the Big Bang, which everyone seems quite happy to say at one point there was nothing, and then all of a sudden there was this something. Somehow that's not considered a religious idea, but I'll put that aside for the time being. More specifically, in terms of human evolution, there's this sort of idea that there was a mitochondrial Eve, where all humans can be tracked to a single mother who existed at some point in Africa, and everyone comes from this one genetic source. Now, actual bioanthropology has more or less completely disproven this theory. And in fact, Africa had dozens, if not hundreds, of different types of hominid species, all of which could be said to have something like a culture. They had tools, they had a capacity to make art, and so forth. And we are used to thinking of something like Neanderthals, but there were actually a whole range of other ones scattered all over Africa, and somehow over the course of a few 100,000 years, they all became this one species, Homo sapiens. Now, no one's exactly sure how or why, but it certainly wasn't a single point of origin. Another thing that anthropologists have recently undermined is the common assumption or understanding that human civilization developed, and the assumption is that there was a point prior to civilization, there was a state of nature, everyone was fairly instinctive and happy, maybe a little bit violent, and then at some point agriculture came along, complexity started to happen, and then there was this trade-off between the complexity we needed to run our agricultural infrastructure, and that this is sort of the origin of social hierarchies. So because of this, we need to have kings, we need to have priests, we need to have elites that manage and coordinate civilization on behalf of this increasingly large population. Now, the actual archaeological and anthropological evidence has, again, completely undermined this as ever having actually been real. This is not actually how society developed. Another classic example of this way of thinking is Adam Smith's idea of staged evolution, moving from hunters to shepherds to farmers to commerce. And that's just like the linear stage model of humans moving from a primitive position to a more civilized position. Again, the archaeological evidence shows that there's a whole range of different types of civilization. Some of these were decentralized. A lot of the governance mechanisms were seasonal. So they might come together for a harvest. There'd be a set of people who managed that. And then they'd go disperse back and go back towards their decentralized version of things. Similarly, not every agricultural society that developed necessarily had a hierarchical system. In fact, there was quite a lot of political fluidity. A lot of societies might start as hierarchical and then consciously choose to become non-hierarchical, and vice versa. There were also quite a large number of urban centers that have been discovered that do not have evidence of there being a centralized king or authority. So hopefully this establishes that there's a lot of different types of civilizations for us to look at. They're not one single thing, and that they evolve in relation to other things and other civilizations. So there's no line, there's no telos, and there's all these different paths that civilization could go in. And as a consequence, human civilizations are hugely diverse. So one of the problems in the way that Europeans interpreted civilizations by saying this is the way Europe evolved and developed, and everything else is a sort of poor quality or childlike version of this path. Once you remove that idea as not being actually factually true, then you start to see that there's this huge variety of civilizations that have existed across time. And now we start to become interested in how do those civilizations become linked to one another and become unlinked, and what are the various points of contact and exchange that these civilizations incorporate globally and within themselves. So this is a quote here that I often use from another 19th century sociologist, Emil Durkheim, and he says that really the only thing that human societies have in common is that they're completely diverse and unlike any other society. You could probably say the same thing about individuals. But the big thing that's different for us in the West, we have developed this particular worldview and ideology that makes us all think that we're fully individuals. The legal system reinforces this, the economic system reinforces this, political system. They all reinforce this idea that all of our experiences are the result of individual choices, whereas actually there's a huge amount of the way that we behave as individuals that are based off the way society is organized. And if we can see that societies can be organized in lots of different ways, This can reveal the huge variety of possibilities that that societies have, that they can choose different pathways, and even we as individuals gain more of that means of orientation, that knowledge of different choices, by realizing the extent to which we're actually following a path. So one of the jobs Durkheim had was to communicate this to secondary school teachers in France, to communicate the diversity of humanity that goes beyond just the way that we happen to be raised. The problem with that is, how does that not lead to everybody saying, well, everybody's different, everyone's diverse, let's throw everything in the mix and say, look at the magic of humanity, everything's wonderful and great. The problem with that is it's not particularly scientific. It's also not particularly true, because there's a whole range of things that humans do have in common. And there's actually a method for studying this. This is not something I'm going to go into detail. Just wanted to point out that John Stuart Mill's system of logic provided a method for us social scientists to say, these are the things that different civilizations have in common. These are the things that are different. And then you can work out how the similarities are related to other similarities and how they vary. And what you can establish is some very baseline commonalities that undermine the sense of civilization being one thing, and yet it's not completely random either. So we've already thrown out quite a number of things. We've thrown out the idea of hierarchy as being essential to civilization. We've thrown out the idea that there was some mitochondrial Eve in Africa. I sort of suggested maybe the Big Bang was a bit too far. I won't be too controversial on that, and we'll just set that aside as being not relevant for this particular course. But one of the things that humans do have in common is culture. So this is Norbert Elias again. I mentioned him earlier. This quote he has is worth studying. It's from a late book that he wrote called The Symbol Theory. And he says, the character and function of the human-made sounds we call languages as symbolic representations of the facts and functions of a really existing world is one of several distinctly unique aspects of human communication. One can say that a very wide capacity for changing their mode of life is one of the biological endowments of the human species. Perhaps its most basic aspect is the almost unlimited capacity for human groups for absorbing, storing, and digesting novel experiences in the forms of symbols. So, what Elias also mentions in the same text is you can find a bird species in Canada and another bird species in Russia, and the sounds that they make are basically the same. So the species is not differentiating itself in terms of communication. It differentiates itself biologically. And at some point, humans became differentiated, somewhere in Africa to be sure, and they somehow became one species. And then they began to retain the single biological condition for much longer than is typical of biologically evolving species. So we stopped differentiating ourselves as species and started to differentiate ourselves in terms of languages, cultures, different ways of organizing our societies. And it seems as though that's something that actually humans have that other animals don't have, which is the capacity to, as a group, completely change the way that it organizes itself socially and culturally. And the way that it does that is by having access to a shared set of symbols or language. And that gives the capacity for me to talk to you and for you to know that I'm talking about the same thing. So that's Elias's position. Another similar position developed by a sociologist named Robert Bellah focuses particularly on the point at which what he would call mimetic culture becomes narrative culture. So other animals can perform mimesis. They can copy another animal and their sounds. So you think of dogs, birds, whatever, they can copy each other, and that produces an episodic experience. So they can interact in an event, and we also have a whole range of episodic parts of our experiences. The difference is that once we have a language that we can share with other people, and also develop inside our own consciousness conversations with ourselves and concepts that we can retain across time, once we have that experience, and that experience can be related to another one over there, that's a similar or different thing, and then we could start to construct a narrative that we share, all of a sudden humans obtain this capacity to coordinate across huge areas of space, across time, across lineages. So it's this narrative capacity that humans have that other animals don't have that allows us to have this social adaptation capacity. I won't read the full quote there, but that's basically what it says. So back to Norbert Elias's means of orientation. And one of the ways that I've reframed some of what he's talking about is to think about language as a means of communication, so we can talk about the same things. Knowledge is that much more complex and becomes a way for us to understand the same things by having the same shared means of orientation to those categories. And one of the interesting things about language is that none of us have this capacity in advance. We have the capacity to learn a language, but we will learn whatever language we're born into. And that's because society already has that language in advance. And we learn actually quite slowly compared to other species. It takes humans quite a long time to learn how to communicate and to relate to the world. But in the long run, it adds up to quite a larger intellectual capacity. So we're born into a society that has a language, already has a set of knowledge, and already understands things about the way the world works. And we then learn that language and we learn how the world works. Now, not everyone learns in the same way. And nonetheless, we do learn collectively certain ways of thinking about things. So in this case, we're talking about civilization. There are various ways in which a lot of us have come to understand how civilization works. And what I'm suggesting is we could reorient ourselves, learn a new way, and start to see ourselves in a different way, and that there's some value in reconstructing what that might be. So once you understand the sense of an alternative, once you break down those standard assumptions of European understanding, we can reapply Michael Mann's ideology, economics, military, and political thinking. So let's just look at a few examples, not in depth, but just for the purposes of seeing how this looks in practice. So this is the Roman Empire, and in the classic analysis Kenneth Clark was using. At some point, the Romans armed the Germans, who were up above the river Danube there, and the Germans came and they captured Rome. And the barbarians were the barbarians at the gate, and everything fell apart. Culture ended, and that's when the Goths came in. Now, there's a lot of things going on at the time. There were actually a lot of other relations and things happening. Mongols and Huns were coming from Central Asia. They were coming into Hungary, displacing the Hungarians that were moving into the German territories. In fact, the Germans were basically, there's a huge mass migration happening, and everything was becoming chaotic. And a lot of that has to do with the way the Romans set up these large international trade networks that linked up all of these different parts of the world. And word got out that these Romans seem to have quite a lot of wealth. And ecologically, there's another interesting factor going on. A lot of people today are starting to date the start of the Anthropocene, the point at which the humans started to change the biosphere and the Earth system, to the Roman Empire, because there's actually such a quantity of lead that was produced from their silver mines that it's still visible in the ice sheets. And I didn't realize this, but the Romans would use lead for all sorts of things, feeding babies, putting inside teas for health purposes, and so on. So there's this material element also impacting these things. The other thing that happens is Rome doesn't actually fall. The Roman Empire doesn't go away. It's already reestablished itself in Constantinople, and what we tend to call the Byzantine Empire was explicitly founded as a new Rome, and that lasted until 1300, 1400, so essentially another 1,000 years the Roman Empire continued to exist. So it's a bit odd to think that because it didn't exist in Britain or it didn't exist in Rome, that the Roman Empire ended. It actually was still cruising right along on the eastern part of the Mediterranean. So that's just one example of how once you get rid of the line, it changes the whole way you look at these things. Another instance is that we associate a lot of civilization on things like Greeks and Romans. And that's because they built a lot of big stone buildings and they wrote things down. In fact, a huge portion of human civilization has taken place on coastlines because it's the most productive area for fishing, mussels, shrimping. But the problem with coastlines is they get wiped away as the sea levels rise, and there's no stone remnants of it and so forth. So a lot of that artifact history is gone. But even if you do look at stone monuments, as archaeologists have historically created this idea that there's always this elite managing everything. So the Indus Valley civilization, for example, was not organized around either written words and potentially not by an elite at all, although it's hard to say. But there's this place called Mohenjo-Daro, which is in the Indus Valley from 2500 to 1700 BCE, and it's actually described as faceless. The reason it's called faceless is because there's no statues of any big important kings or priests. It's totally unlike Egypt or Rome, where there's always these emperors. And in Mohenjo-Daro, there's a sense that there's no important person in this space, and that the bath was the most important site, and that's where they would do these ritual cleansing rituals. In a quote unquote normal space, there'd be this centralized concentration of metal and artifacts, which indicates that it's the palace. And in fact, at this site, they're spread out and distributed quite evenly across the whole city. So all of that's taking place, and even up to 1700, there's still no written language. What they do have is a very substantial oral tradition, which eventually becomes the Vedas. So the Rig Veda and a lot of Indian myths were eventually written down in 500 BC, but that's still another 1,000 years later. And the way that the knowledge system was transferred was from guru to student orally. And by this point, there's still no clear origin of hierarchy in the sense we're used to thinking about from Rousseau's point of view. And even the point at which it gets written down, when you start to see the supposed evidence of the caste system within this Vedic culture, that's actually coincides with the Persian invasion of Indian civilization. So a similar thing happens when the British colonize India. They take what is a very complicated and fluid caste system, and they say, I need to know who's in charge, who's at the bottom, who's at the top, because we need to start administering an imperial bureaucracy. And that's where these quite fluid systems get established as rigid hierarchies. Another instance, another instance is the Swahili civilization, or the Kilwa Kiswani, which was a chronicle which was purely orally transmitted. And by the time the Portuguese arrived off the coast of East Africa, this is what it looked like. It was quite a substantial civilization. It was also a hybrid civilization between African, East African, and Arabic and Islamic civilizations. It's interesting to think about the Portuguese because in a lot of post-colonial thinking, they retain this idea that the point at which these civilizations start to decline is when European contact is made in the 15th or 16th century. But prior to European figuring out that you could go around Africa, there's several thousand years of trade going on in the Indian Ocean, and there were all sorts of waves of Islamic influence, Buddhist influence. There's the Mongols created trade land network across the Silk Road, and each of these waves of international trade produced cultural hybridity and exchanges in the way that you see Kilwa down there in East Africa, but you could say the same thing about India, which has a huge coastline, and all of these areas were connected more or less at similar levels to the Mediterranean, the civilization that we're more familiar with. So all of these things are going to be explored and discussed. And it's worth including all of these examples when we begin to reconstruct the aims of the course. And the reason why I thought this was pursuing at this point was not just to reconstruct a new version of Kenneth Clark. He's already done a good job of doing his own task, which was a particular way of understanding civilization from his personal point of view. But I think what's more interesting about today is the way, as a civilization, we are sort of ignoring or avoiding certain questions. And I think in one direction, that's a consequence of a kind of imperial nostalgia where there's not an understanding or a desire to engage with the role of England or Britain when it's an island. It doesn't have an empire. And yet we have all of these institutions all around us that are based in that experience and that organizational system, that civilization. But culturally, it doesn't have that role anymore. And so on one side of society, we're trying to ignore that because we want to bring back some kind of greatness. On another side of society, there's this critical position that thinks that Britain did everything it did was really bad and should be thrown out. And they were slave traders, and we don't want to celebrate these people anymore. But at the same time, that's not, to me, a very nuanced position. It's very unlikely that any civilization at any point was all good or all bad. The categories of good and bad are sort of what you might want to have for art. You might want to know which is better or worse. These are good or bad types of behavior, but a whole civilization as complex and huge as that are always going to have some bad bits and some good bits, and mostly quite a lot of neutral bits. So Victorian society, you could say the same thing about it. And if we looked around today, there's some good bits, some bad bits. There's not really a lot of use in sort of either praising or condemning a civilization in that sense. Another reason why I don't think we are thinking through these types of big questions is that we haven't actually addressed one of the major things, according to sociologist Andrew Abbott says, by far the most significant event in the 20th century is the dramatic extension of lifespans to where a large percentage of us are growing to about 70 or 80 years old. In the past, you might have 2 or 3 generations living together at the same time, because most of the previous generations would have been dead at about 50 or 60. Whereas now you've got all of these different generations, each of whom came of age at a fully different time. And as you get older, the experience of society changing over and over and over again, it's just not stopping. Whereas if you're younger, we just want to throw the old statues out of the water. We just want to throw everything out and start again. And the folks that are that much older say, oh no, not again. Didn't we do that in the 1970s? Okay, so these 3 things seem to be causing us to have this sense of civilization and not wanting to address it. So that's happening in spite of the fact we have more information, more access to different parts of the world and cultures. So to conclude, I'll just take us once again back to Elias and the Maelstrom. And what he's suggesting is that skill that humans have developed to engage with symbols and to engage with language and understand knowledge provides humans with access to space and time in 4 dimensions, but there's also this 5th dimension of consciousness. And that's a social type of consciousness. It's not an individual's language, knowledge, and it's not an individual's capacity. It's something that the society as a whole has greater or lesser degrees of means of communicating, means of orienting, and practical technical skills, which are social funds that we are born into in particular times and places. And so the argument that I'd like to leave with, and why I hope you'll come to the next lecture next month, is that the more that we can understand other societies and other civilizations, the better we can become detached from our own situation by getting outside of that experience and start to say, well, things worked a bit differently over there in the past. And so that's what we'll be doing for the rest of the course. So next month, we'll be looking at rituals, migration, and how those things were there at the origins, I suppose, of civilization. But to what extent are those things still present with us in the present? And to what extent have we actually changed, if not evolved? So that's it. And thank you for joining us.